In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a terrarium ecosystem for some beautiful and amazing creatures, and I'll even be adding a deadly apex predator. Be sure to stick around to the end, it's going to be a good one. To build the ecosystem in, I'm using this glass bowl. Obviously, it's going to need a lid on the top, but I'll address that at the end. To get started, I first need to work on the drainage layer. To make this layer, you've got many options, and I'll show you a few examples. This here is pea gravel. It's easy and cheap to get hold of, and it works great as a drainage layer. The only downside is that it is quite heavy, and in larger terrariums the weight certainly adds up. Fine aquarium gravel is also a great option. You can get it in loads of different colours, so if you want the drainage to stand out and pop, it's definitely the one for you. If you're on a budget, you can even use rocks from outside. Just make sure that you wash them off before using them and that they're not too big. All these options will work great, but my go-to material is lita. It is slightly more expensive than some of the other options, but I'd say it's worth it. It's super lightweight and porous, making it perfect for drainage. Now, in case you didn't know, the purpose of a drainage layer is to hold excess water inside the terrarium ecosystem. Without a drainage layer, excess water will sit in the substrate and quickly cause it to stagnate. This is certainly not ideal, and it will almost always result in the end of the terrarium's life. With that being said, you can get away without a drainage layer in smaller terrariums, but for one this size, I'd always put one in place. It really doesn't need to be too deep, and just an inch or so would do. Although the drainage layer is now complete, if I was to pour the substrate in now, it would simply fall through all the gaps between the stones. This example shows you how easy it will get through. Now, you're never going to be able to keep the drainage completely free of substrate, but there's something you can do which will certainly help. This here is window screen mesh, and I'm going to use it to act as a substrate barrier. It's fine enough to prevent the substrate from getting down to the drainage while still allowing water to freely pass through. I should mention I'll leave links to this and all the other materials I'll be using in case you want to try something like this yourself. It's a good idea to cut it slightly larger than it needs to be, as it will really help hold the substrate in place. With the substrate barrier in place, let's move on to creating the terrarium substrate mix. I'm going to show you how to make this substrate, which I use for pretty much all of my terrariums. Firstly, you're going to need a tub to measure out the parts and a tub to mix everything up in. To start off, I'm going to measure out 2 parts of sphagnum moss. I often get asked how to measure in parts, so let me quickly explain. 1 part is simply the total volume of the tub that you choose to use. In this case, I need 2 parts sphagnum moss, so I'm filling up the tub twice and pouring it into the mixing tub. For example, if I needed 1 part, it will only be 1 tub, or if I needed half a part, it will only be half of the tub. Next in the recipe is the cocoa fibre. I rehydrated a cocoa fibre brick earlier, ready to be used. You're only going to need 1 part cocoa fibre. Next up is 1/4 part orchid bark. If you can't get hold of orchid bark, most small bark chips work great as an alternative. Next is 1/4 part crushed charcoal, followed by 1/4 part worm castings. Once mixed up, all these components come together to make the perfect terrarium substrate. It holds moisture, is resistant to compression, provides nutrients for the plants, and it's well draining. These 4 things are key characteristics of a quality terrarium substrate. With the substrate complete, it's now time to start pouring it inside the ecosystem. I'm adding a generous amount and then gently spreading it out and pressing it down into place with the back of my hand. Now the substrate's in, it's time for my favourite part, which is the hardscape. I'm going to use this piece of spiderwood, which in my opinion resembles an old tree stump with exposed roots. After a bit of experimentation, I like how it looks over on the right side, but I do want to build the substrate up a little bit higher. When creating a hardscape, it's all about trial and error and coming up with a layout you like and are happy with. After all, it's your terrarium, so if you like how it looks, then you've done a good job. I'm loving how this spiderwood is looking inside the terrarium, but I do feel like it's a bit empty on the left side, so I'm going to add another piece. Now the spiderwood's in, I want to place in a few rocks to add a bit of contrast. This here is black lava rock, and I think it will be perfect for this terrarium. All I'm going to do is place them in and around the spiderwood to add some contrast. I must say they do blend in quite a lot at the moment, but once the moss and plants are in, these black rocks will stand out nicely. I absolutely love how this hardscape's turned out, but now it's time to bring it to life with moss and plants. The first thing I want to do is add a carpet of moss throughout the foreground. The moss I'm going to use to do that is cushion moss. It's a lush green, slow-growing species which is perfect for beginners. I'm splitting it up into smaller chunks and then trimming off the base to make it shorter. This doesn't hurt the moss at all, but it means it can sit closer to the substrate, which will look better in this style terrarium. I'm placing it in small chunks at a time and then gently pressing it down onto the substrate. Now I'm going to repeat the same process throughout the foreground, and whilst I do that, let me quickly tell you about my terrarium making ebook. Building terrariums is super fun and rewarding, but it can seem a bit daunting and intimidating if you're a beginner. My ebook contains everything you need to know to make a long-lasting, successful terrarium with plenty of tips and tricks along the way. It will certainly give you a head start and help you avoid some of the unfortunate mistakes that all beginners go through. If you're interested, it will be at the top of the description and in the pinned comment. Now let's get back to the build. Now the moss is in, I'm loving how this terrarium's looking and it's really starting to take shape. I have left a small gap down the centre and you'll see why I've done this shortly. Next I want to plant in this Boston fern towards the back to help fill out the background. Before planting it in, I'm going to firstly add some leaf litter on top of the substrate. Although these won't be visible, they'll certainly be beneficial for some of the creatures that I'll be adding later. They'll provide shelter and a source of food. Now let's get back to the planting. I've prepared this fern by taking it out the pot and removing as much of the soil as I can. After deciding where to place it, I'm going to use some long tweezers to dig a hole down into the substrate. I can then take the fern and plant the roots inside. All that's left to do is to gently compress the substrate in and around the roots and then it's good to go. I've got another Boston fern and I'm going to plant it the same way to fill out the left side. I think planting them ferns to fill out the background already makes this terrarium look 10 times better. Before going any further, I'm going to address the gap that I left down the centre. I've left it clear so I can create a sand path. Having a sand path is a simple and easy way of creating more detail and interest inside a terrarium. It does have its place and it doesn't look great in every scape, but I think it has the potential of looking good in this one. It does look a bit odd and out of place at the moment, but some small black lava rock will fix that. All I'm doing is placing some small pieces throughout the sand and it will really help make it look more natural. I want to know what you think. Do you like it with the path or without? Let me know in the comments. It's important not to let the moss and plants dry out when building the terrarium, so I like to give it a good spray down every now and then. The benefit of having lots of terrariums is that you can take cuttings from other builds and not have to buy as many plants when making a new one. This here is a terrarium that I made a good few months ago. It's super healthy and in need of a trim. All I'm doing is trimming off the stems and pulling out the cuttings. They'll send out new shoots and grow back in no time at all. The cuttings can then be planted into their new home. Now you might be wondering how they're going to survive without any roots, and the answer to that is simple. Once planted into the terrarium, these cuttings will send out new roots in no time at all. This is known as plant propagation, and a terrarium actually provides perfect conditions as the humidity and moisture level is high. Now I want to start adding some smaller plants to add some more detail and interest. This Pilea glauca is a great start. It's super easy to grow and stays relatively small, and I think it will add some nice variety to the leaf shape inside this terrarium. Next up is one of my favourite terrarium plants. I propagated this oak leaf creeping fig myself from just 2 or 3 cuttings. I am thinking about making a video showing you how to grow and propagate your own plants in small pots like these. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. All I'm doing is using some scissors to take a few cuttings. I'm then using some long tweezers to go ahead and plant them inside the terrarium. I mainly want them growing up on the spiderwood branches. Next up, I've got some Begonia lita. This is a beautiful terrarium plant which has these stunning iridescent leaves. I'm hoping it's going to slowly grow and creep throughout the foreground. The wider variety of plants you use that have different leaf shape, size and texture, the more natural your terrarium is going to look. The last plant I want to add is a few cuttings of this Hydrocotyle. You may or may not know, but this is actually an aquatic plant that loves to grow in terrarium conditions. So long as the humidity is kept high, it will thrive. I'm absolutely loving how the terrarium's looking with the plants in, and it truly is looking like a slice of nature. After a quick spray down, I now want to add a few more details to the hardscape. I've got some small spiderwood branches which I'm simply just going to place in and around the scape. I do this in a lot of my builds and I really do think it adds another level of detail. There is a slight colour difference between the spiderwood roots and the spiderwood branches, but it won't take long for them all to blend in together. Now it's finally time to start adding some life. I'm going to add plenty of creatures to this ecosystem and even an apex predator at the end, but to start off I've got some springtails. Although these are the smallest creatures that I'll be adding, they're arguably the most important. These tiny hard-working bugs will keep the terrarium ecosystem clean by eating things like mould and decaying matter. This food is then processed and pooped out in the form of fertiliser for the moss and plants. The plants will then use these nutrients to grow, resulting in oxygen being produced, which all the creatures inside this ecosystem will use to live. It truly is amazing watching everything work together to keep the ecosystem thriving. Next to go in the terrarium, I've got two different types of isopods. This is the larger species of the two and they're absolutely stunning. They'll play a similar role to the springtails in breaking down decaying matter throughout the ecosystem. I'm introducing 10 of them that all range in size. They waste no time at all and get straight to exploring. Next to go in is these dwarf purple isopods. They're much smaller than the other species but still a lot bigger than springtails. Although all these creatures will play a key role in keeping the ecosystem clean and healthy, they'll also serve another purpose. As you may have guessed, they'll also serve as a source of food for the predator that I'm going to add later. The next creature that I'm going to add to this ecosystem is some of these tiny adorable garlic snails. They stay unbelievably small and this is about as big as they'll get. Although these tiny snails are often seen as pests, in my experience they leave the live plants alone and like to feed on decaying matter such as the leaf litter. Once everything is established, I'm going to add the predator, but for now I'm going to give the entire ecosystem a good spray down. When watering a terrarium, it's very important that you don't overwater. Only water until the substrate is damp. It should not be wet or soggy. Now all that's left to do is to place on a clear acrylic lid and let this ecosystem establish for a few weeks. Four weeks have passed and I'm glad to say that this terrarium is doing great. It doesn't really look like it's grown in too much, but that's because I mostly selected slow growing plants. Some of the faster growing plants such as the Hydrocotyle will likely pick up their growth rate from this point on as they've now established a healthy root system. You may have noticed that there is a slight mould outbreak on some of the spiderwood. I'm not worried about this at all and it's completely normal for new terrariums to go through a mould phase in the first few weeks. The springtails and other microfauna will take care of it in no time. As expected, I haven't really seen much of the creatures living in here as they do spend most of their time in the moss and in the substrate. With that said, if you look hard enough you can always see one or two going about their day. Before introducing the predator, I need to make one quick change. If I was to leave this lid as it is, I'm almost certain it's going to escape. I'm using some hot glue to fill in all the holes. Now it's time to take a look at the soon-to-be apex predator of this ecosystem. This here is a brown centipede. Although it might not look too scary, in the terrarium world it's a deadly predator. It will feed on the small microfauna such as the springtails, isopods and snails and help keep their population in check. Without further ado, let's get it inside the ecosystem. Feel free to drop your name suggestions in the comments below. It will spend most of its time living under the damp moss, but when nighttime falls, that's when it will go on the hunt. Although harmless to humans, they have venomous claws on the sides of their head which they'll use to catch their prey. I really hope you enjoyed this terrarium ecosystem build and found it useful. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future builds or updates, and thank you for watching. If you want to see me build another ecosystem, check out this video here.